Picture this. I dropped 2 years and $4,000 of my own money on speed bumps in front of my house. Not for me, but for the kids on bikes, for the elderly couple next door who were nearly hit by a speeding truck. I followed every rule: permits, city codes, HOA approval. I did it 100% right. Then, one regular Tuesday morning, I jolt awake to the scream of a jackhammer right outside my window. I run out in socks. A crew is tearing up my speed bumps. Orders from Darlene Whitfield, the new HOA president who had just taken power. 11 days. No call, no vote. She just decided to destroy my work. When I confronted her, she smirks and says, "This is for the good of the neighborhood, sweetie." That was her worst mistake ever. Because I made one phone call, just one. It cost her the throne, the HOA, the whole street, the contract, everything. Gone. To understand why this hit me so hard, you need to know a little about Cloverfield Lane, not the movie, the actual street. A quiet, curved residential road in a mid-sized suburb outside Columbus, Ohio. The kind of neighborhood that smells like cut grass and charcoal on summer weekends, where the mailman knows your dog's name and the ice cream truck still comes by at 6 o'clock. I moved here with my wife, Priscilla, and our 2 daughters 12 years ago. We chose this street specifically because it felt like a community, real neighbors who wave from their driveways. I am Garrett Holloway. I worked 22 years as a union pipe fitter before I transitioned into residential property management. That means I know buildings, I know contracts, and I know exactly what people are and aren't allowed to do to property that isn't theirs. That background mattered a lot before this story was done. For the first decade, the HOA here was basically a non-event. Monthly dues of $85, occasional newsletter about gutter cleaning, a block party every 4th of July. The president was a retired school teacher named Herschel Okafor, a gentle, deliberate man who ran meetings like a patient mediator and genuinely tried to serve the neighborhood. Under Herschel, the HOA was what it was supposed to be, a vehicle for community improvement, not personal empire building. Then Herschel moved to be closer to his grandkids in Arizona, and everything changed. Darlene Whitfield had lived on Cloverfield Lane for 3 years. She'd moved in after what neighbors described in hushed tones as a difficult divorce. And she'd spent those 3 years making her presence known in the way that a smoke alarm makes its presence known. Constant, shrill, and impossible to ignore without doing something about it. She filed noise complaints against a teenager who practiced guitar in his garage. She demanded that a homeowner repaint their mailbox post because the green was one shade off from the approved palette. She submitted a 14-page written objection to a neighbor's Halloween inflatable, citing visual blight. The woman weaponized the word community standards the way a surgeon uses a scalpel, except surgeons use scalpels to help people. She ran for HOA president unopposed because nobody else wanted the job, and she won by default in March. 11 days into her term, she turned her attention to me. Here's the backstory on the speed bumps because it matters. 2 years prior, a delivery van had nearly flattened a 7-year-old named Cooper Briggs while he was chasing a ball into the street. The driver wasn't even speeding egregiously, maybe 32 and a 25, but the road curves just enough that the sight lines are bad. It was pure luck that Cooper walked away with a scraped elbow instead of something far worse. After that, I organized a petition. 63 out of 71 households signed it and took it to both the HOA and the City Transportation Office. It took 8 months, 2 engineering assessments, and 1 very firm letter from the city before we got the green light for 2 rubberized speed bumps at the curve. The HOA under Herschel approved the installation. The city permitted it. I paid the contractor out of pocket for $1,200. No reimbursement. I didn't ask for any. I just wanted the kids on this street to be safe. Darlene had voted against the speed bumps at the original HOA meeting, calling them an aesthetic imposition. She'd lost that vote 7-2. Herschel was still president then. The bumps went in. Everybody moved on. Until that Tuesday morning when I stepped outside in my socks into the cold April air. The smell of diesel exhaust already heavy. The jackhammer already biting into the asphalt with a sound like a mechanical angry god. And I realized Darlene hadn't moved on at all. She'd just been waiting for her moment. I stood on my front lawn watching those two workers chip away at the first speed bump with the focused intensity of men who were being paid by the hour and had no opinion about the politics involved. The morning air had that sharp, chalky smell you get when concrete gets pulverized, bitter and gritty at the back of my throat. My neighbor across the street, Terrence Dobbs, a retired firefighter who wakes up at 5 o'clock every morning, was already on his porch with a coffee mug, watching with the expression of a man who'd seen trouble arrive before and knew exactly what it looked like. "They got a work order," he called over to me. "Supposedly," I said, but I didn't know that yet. I was still processing. I walked over to the lead worker, a heavy-set guy in a faded orange vest who smelled like cigarette smoke and WD-40, and asked him point-blank who had authorized this removal. He handed me a folded paper. It was an HOA maintenance authorization form signed by Darlene Whitfield, listing the speed bumps as unauthorized modifications to common area infrastructure, which was interesting because speed bumps installed on a city-permitted easement on a street maintained by the municipality are absolutely not HOA infrastructure. I knew that, but apparently nobody had told Darlene, or she knew and didn't care. I was beginning to suspect the latter. I took photos of the form, photos of the workers, photos of the damage in progress. Then I went inside, called Darlene's number, and got voicemail. I left a calm, factual message. I told her the installation had been city permitted, that the HOA had no legal jurisdiction over street infrastructure under Ohio Revised Code Section 5571, and that I expected the work to stop immediately pending a proper review. She called me back 4 minutes later. "Garrett," she said in the bright, weaponized cheerfulness of someone who has decided that condescension is a form of power. "The HOA board reviewed the speed bumps at last week's meeting and determined they were installed without a proper HOA variance. That's in violation of Section 4.3 of our covenants." "Darlene," I said, "I'm going to need you to tell those workers to stop. They'll be done by noon," she said pleasantly. "Have a great morning." She hung up. Here's what Darlene didn't know, and this is important because it's the first legal beat. A homeowners association's authority ends at the property line of the individual homes and the explicitly designated common areas defined in the original recorded plat. Cloverfield Lane itself, the street surface, the curbing, the easements, was a public right-of-way maintained under a city road maintenance agreement. The HOA had zero jurisdiction there. Zero. Not a little. Zero. Always check your county's recorded plat map and road maintenance agreements before assuming your HOA has authority over street infrastructure. In most municipalities, they don't. I knew this cold, but I also knew that simply being right doesn't stop a jackhammer that's already running. So I made my first move. I called the city's public works department and reported unpermitted removal of city-adjacent infrastructure. Within 40 minutes, a city inspector named Walt Gruber showed up in a white pickup truck. Walt was not a complicated man. He had a clipboard, a measuring tape, and the unhurried certainty of someone who has spent 20 years making sure people follow rules they'd rather ignore. He reviewed my original permit documentation on his phone, walked over to the workers, and asked to see their city work authorization. Because even though the HOA ordered this removal, any work affecting a city easement requires a separate city permit. Darlene had gotten an HOA maintenance form signed. She had not gotten a city permit because she didn't think she needed one. Walt Gruber issued a stop work order at 10:47 in the morning. One speed bump was gone. The second was intact. And Darlene Whitfield had just received her first lesson in the difference between HOA paperwork and actual legal authority. But she wasn't done. Not by a long shot. By that afternoon, she'd emailed every household on Cloverfield Lane a letter, 12 paragraphs, which is 9 more than any neighborhood email has ever needed, calling the speed bumps a safety hazard that created dangerous hydraulic flow disruption during rain events. She cited no studies. She included a stock photo of a flooded road that had absolutely nothing to do with our street. She framed herself as a conscientious leader protecting the neighborhood from my reckless, unpermitted modifications. She also quietly called an emergency board meeting for Thursday night with a specific agenda item: formal censure of resident Garrett Holloway for unauthorized street modification. She was going to make an example of me. She was going to use the HOA as a hammer. What she didn't realize was that I'd spent 22 years working around people who swung hammers for a living. I knew exactly how to step out of the way. Thursday night came fast. The HOA meeting was held in the community room of the neighborhood's small clubhouse, a low-slung building with fluorescent lighting, folding chairs, and the faint smell of old carpet and someone's microwave dinner from 3 nights ago. Normally, these meetings drew maybe 8 or 10 residents. This one drew 41. Word had gotten around. I sat in the third row with Terrence on my left and my neighbor Beverly Kessler on my right. Beverly, a retired paralegal with the sharp, watchful eyes of someone who has spent decades noticing what people say and, more importantly, what they leave out. I'd briefed both of them beforehand. We were not going to be loud. We were not going to be reactive. We were going to listen, document, and respond with facts. Darlene opened the meeting in a cream blazer and a lanyard bearing an HOA badge that she absolutely did not need to be wearing. She thanked everyone for attending, called the attendance a testament to how much our community cares, and then proceeded to present a 6-slide presentation. Yes, a PowerPoint, outlining her case for censuring me. The slides had stock images of speed bumps, drainage diagrams that appeared to have been copied from a municipal report for a completely different city, and a timeline that conveniently omitted the part where I'd followed every proper channel to get those bumps installed. She called on the board's treasurer, a mild accountant named Philip Serrano, to read a prepared statement. Philip read it with the energy of a man who deeply regrets agreeing to something but has too much Midwestern politeness to back out. The statement claimed that my installation had created a liability exposure for the HOA. When the floor opened for resident comments, I raised my hand first. I stood up, introduced myself calmly, and then I read the relevant section of Ohio Revised Code 5571 aloud, specifically the subsection establishing that public streets and their pertinent structures fall under municipal, not private association jurisdiction. I then produced the original city permit for the installation, the engineering assessment, and the inspector's stop work order from Tuesday, which noted that the HOA's removal effort had itself been unpermitted. I said, to the extent the HOA claims liability exposure, I'd suggest the exposure actually flows in the other direction. Ordering unpermitted work on a city easement exposes the association to municipal sanctions. I'd recommend the board consult an attorney before this goes further. Darlene smiled like a woman who had already won the argument in her head. Thank you, Garrett, she said in the tone you use with a child who has said something amusing but incorrect. The board will take your comments under advisement. They voted 4-1 to issue the formal censure. Philippe Serrano voted no. He looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth. Now, here's where Darlene made her second mistake, and it was a doozy. Emboldened by the vote, she sent a follow-up letter to every resident the next morning. In it, she stated that my original speed bump installation had been done without proper HOA authorization and strongly implied, that I had acted deceptively and possibly fraudulently. I want you to understand what that word means legally. Fraud is not a word you throw around casually in a letter sent to 67 households. It's a specific legal allegation with very specific implications for the person making it. Beverly Kessler read that letter at her kitchen table, set it down, looked at me over her reading glasses when I stopped by that afternoon, and said, Garrett, she just handed you a defamation claim. Beverly was not wrong. I didn't rush to a lawyer that day, though. I had something more pressing to deal with because Darlene, still riding the high of her censure vote, had escalated again. She'd contacted the city directly, claiming that my original permit had been obtained under false pretenses and requesting that the city investigate. She'd also begun a quiet campaign to get signatures on a petition demanding that I pay the cost of the speed bump removal. She was going to make me pay for something I'd built for kids' safety after she'd torn it down without permission. It was the kind of logic that only makes sense if you've convinced yourself that authority is the same thing as being right. I took a long walk that evening around the block, past the place where the first speed bump used to be. Just raw asphalt now, a pale scar in the road where the rubber had been pulled away. The neighborhood kids were playing in the cul-de-sac down the street that late afternoon, hollering in laughter that sounds exactly the same in every neighborhood everywhere. Cooper Briggs was out there on his bike. I thought about the van. I thought about how close it had been, and I decided I was done playing defense. While Darlene was busy sending letters and filing complaints, I quietly began making some inquiries of my own. The first thing I did was pull the HOA's governing documents, not just the CC and RS, the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, but the full recorded plat, the original declaration of the Homeowners Association, and every amendment that had been filed with the county recorder's office since the neighborhood was developed in 1987. This is all public record. You can walk into most county recorder offices or go online and request these documents. I printed them out, 62 pages of dense legal language that smelled like a copy machine and tasted like a Saturday afternoon sacrificed. I was looking for two things. First, the exact boundaries of HOA authority. Second, and this was the hunch that had been nagging at me since the meeting, whether the HOA itself had been maintaining its own compliance with those governing documents. Because in my experience, the people most aggressive about enforcing rules on others are often the least careful about following the rules themselves. It took me most of a Saturday, 3 cups of coffee, and one very patient reading of Amendment 7 filed in 2003 to find it. The HOA had a reserve fund requirement. Specifically, the governing documents required that the association maintain a minimum reserve fund equal to 10% of the association's annual operating budget, held in a separate dedicated account for capital improvements and major repairs. This is standard HOA practice, and many states, including Ohio, have provisions that make reserve fund maintenance a fiduciary duty of the board. I requested the HOA's most recent financial disclosures under Ohio's Planned Community Act, which gives residents the right to inspect association financial records. What I found was not good. The reserve fund had been drawn down to less than 2% of budget over the past 3 years, including a withdrawal of $8,000 approved by the previous board's treasurer that was vaguely described as infrastructure maintenance consulting. $8,000 for consulting, undocumented, on a street the HOA didn't even have jurisdiction over. I wasn't sure what that was yet, but I knew it was something. Meanwhile, Darlene had decided that my stop work order win had been a minor setback, and she was ready to pivot. She announced via another email blast, her third in 2 weeks, which several neighbors are now openly calling the Darlene Dispatch, that the HOA would be retaining a private attorney to pursue full recovery of removal costs from me, and that she was exploring additional enforcement options for what she called my pattern of unauthorized activity. Pattern is a loaded word. It implies repetition. It implies a character flaw, not a single disagreement. It implies that the problem is me, not her decision-making. 3 neighbors called me that evening. One of them was Felicity Granger, who lives 2 doors down and has a voice like a retired Sunday school teacher, measured, warm, and somehow carrying the authority of someone who has kept 12-year-olds in line. Felicity told me she'd been on the original HOA board years ago, had left because of internal disagreements she described only as ethical differences, and that she had information she thought I should know. We met for coffee the next morning at her kitchen table, which had a lace tablecloth and the smell of cinnamon and something baking. And Felicity told me something that recontextualized this entire dispute. The street in front of our homes, Cloverfield Lane itself, was not actually fully under city maintenance, or rather, it hadn't always been. In 1994, the original developer of the subdivision had entered into a private road maintenance agreement with the city, under which the HOA held partial maintenance responsibility for the stretch of road from house number 100 through 148, exactly the stretch where my speed bumps had been installed. That agreement had been renewed twice. But Felicity, who had been on the board during the second renewal, believed the most recent renewal had expired. If the maintenance agreement had lapsed, the road had likely reverted to full city control, which meant the HOA not only lacked permit authority for the removal, it may have had zero legitimate involvement in that stretch of road at all. But if the agreement was still active, even partially, it complicated everything. I needed to know which it was. I pulled out my phone and started making calls. The city's public works office keeps records of all active road maintenance agreements in the county. I submitted a public records request under Ohio's Public Records Act, which requires a response within a reasonable time and does not allow agencies to charge for records that can be provided electronically. Public records requests are one of the most underused legal tools available to ordinary residents, and they cost you nothing but a few minutes to fill out the form online. The records came back in 4 business days, and they were extraordinary. The original 1994 maintenance agreement had been renewed in 2001 and again in 2009. The 2009 renewal was a 10-year term set to expire in 2019. According to Public Works records, no renewal had been executed in 2019, 2020, 2021, 2022, or 2023. There was a notation in the file that the HOA had been sent renewal notices in 2018 and 2019, and that both had gone unanswered. The maintenance agreement had lapsed completely in 2019, 5 years ago, which meant that for the past 5 years, the full stretch of Cloverfield Lane in front of our homes had reverted to the city's full jurisdiction and maintenance responsibility. And the HOA had apparently not noticed or had noticed and said nothing, because acknowledging it would have meant acknowledging a failure of fiduciary duty by the board at the time. But here is where it gets beautiful in that specific way that only happens when a bureaucratic oversight collides with someone's overreach at exactly the wrong moment. Because the maintenance agreement had lapsed, the HOA had no authority over Cloverfield Lane. None. Not advisory, not partial, none. Which meant that Darlene's removal order was not just poorly conceived. It was an act of conversion, destroying property, even public infrastructure, without legal authority can constitute a civil tort. And because Darlene had issued the order in her capacity as HOA president using HOA letterhead and HOA funds, the crew had been paid from the HOA's operating budget. The association itself was potentially on the hook. But it gets better. When the agreement lapsed, the city absorbed full maintenance responsibility for the road. That meant the road surface, including the portion damaged by the removal crew, was now city property that had been damaged by an unauthorized third party. The city's public works director, a no-nonsense woman named Constance, had apparently not yet connected the dots, but she was about to. I also went back to that infrastructure maintenance consulting line item, the $8,000 drawn from the reserve fund. With a little more digging through the financial disclosures, I found that the disbursement had been approved in 2021 during a period when Darlene was serving as a non-voting committee chair. The vendor listed was a company called Whitfield Property Consulting LLC, Whitfield, her own company. A payment of $8,000 from HOA funds to a company bearing her own name, approved during a period when she had a material interest in the transaction and no business voting on it. Whether or not she had technically voted on it, the conflict of interest was sitting right there in the records like a neon sign. I had everything I needed. Now I just had to decide how to use it. This is the part where everything that happens next is the result of deliberate preparation. Not anger, not impulse, but a methodical plan built on research, documentation, and the kind of quiet coalition building that doesn't happen at a podium. It happens at kitchen tables, on phone calls, and in carefully worded emails sent at 11 o'clock on a weeknight. My first call was to an attorney, specifically a real estate and community association attorney named Douglas Parrish, who had a small practice in Columbus and a reputation for taking on HOA cases that other lawyers found too unglamorous. I didn't hire him immediately. I spent an hour on a paid consultation, laying out the full picture and asking him to assess my exposure and my options. Douglas had the measured delivery of someone who has heard a lot of neighborhood disputes and learned to mentally separate the ones with actual legal weight from the ones that are just personal grievances in legal clothing. After I finished laying out, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The lapsed maintenance agreement and the self-dealing transaction are the two live wires. The censure letter and the defamation exposure are real, but secondary. Let's focus on the live wires." Here is the plan we assembled piece by piece over the following week. First, the self-dealing issue. Ohio's Planned Community Act contains conflict of interest provisions that prohibit HOA board members or officers from benefiting financially from association transactions without full disclosure and member approval by a supermajority vote. The payment to Whitfield Property Consulting LLC, Darlene's own company, had not been disclosed as a conflict of interest and had not been approved by the membership. This is a potential violation of both the governing documents and state law. Douglas drafted a formal demand letter to the HOA board citing the specific statutory provisions, demanding a full financial audit and the return of the $8,000 to the reserve fund within 30 days. This letter would go out, but not yet. Timing mattered. In most states, HOA board members are legally prohibited from benefiting financially from association funds without member approval. This is codified in statutes like Ohio's Planned Community Act and can result in personal liability for the officer involved. Second, the road damage. I contacted Public Works Director Constance Yee directly, provided the full documentation package, the lapsed agreement, the HOA's work authorization, the stop work order, and photo evidence of the road damage, and filed a formal complaint on behalf of myself and 2 other residents who had signed on, including Terrence and Felicity. This complaint formally put the city on notice that its infrastructure had been damaged by an unauthorized party. Under Ohio law, a municipality can seek restitution from the responsible party for damage to public roads and rights-of-way. Constance Yee, it turned out, was not pleased to discover that her office's failure to flag the lapsed maintenance agreement had allowed this situation to develop, and she was even less pleased that nobody had notified her office before tearing anything out of her road. Third, and this is the piece I'm most proud of, I organized the neighbors, not as an angry mob, not as a protest group, but as a coordinated block of informed homeowners who were going to exercise their rights under the governing documents to call a special membership meeting. Under the HOA's own bylaws, any 15 or more member households could petition for a special meeting to vote on matters of association governance. I collected signatures from 31 households in 3 days. We requested a special meeting with one agenda item, a vote of no confidence in the current HOA president, followed by an emergency board election. 31 out of 71 households. That's a majority and more than enough to compel the board to schedule the meeting. Darlene received the petition on a Wednesday. By Thursday, she'd sent a reply through the HOA's email system calling the petition procedurally improper, which it was not, and suggesting that the 31 signatories had been misled by misinformation. She did not specify what the misinformation was because there wasn't any. She was stalling. That's fine. I had a date I was working toward. The city had scheduled a public infrastructure review meeting for the following month, a routine quarterly session where residents could address public works matters. I had already signed up to speak. I'd also made a quiet call to a local TV station's consumer affairs reporter named Priscilla Adler, who covered neighborhood disputes and local government accountability. I told her I had a story about HOA overreach, lapsed city contracts, and a possible self-dealing financial transaction, and that it would all come to a head at a public meeting in 29 days. "I'll be there," she said. She was. Darlene wasn't sitting still during those 29 days. Give her credit for this. She was a fighter. She just didn't know she'd already lost, and she was burning resources to avoid an outcome that was becoming more inevitable with every move she made. Her first desperate measure was social. She began a whisper campaign among the handful of residents who attended her monthly HOA coffee, a small cliquish gathering that had always skewed toward her inner circle, suggesting that I had financial motivations for the speed bump installation, that I was somehow trying to enhance my property value or position myself to take over the HOA. This was nonsensical on its face. Speed bumps don't increase property values, and I'd never expressed any interest in HOA governance. But nonsense delivered confidently to receptive ears can travel faster than truth delivered carefully. 2 residents reached out to me with concern in their voices, relaying what they'd heard. I thanked them, gave them the factual record, and did not engage with Darlene's narrative directly. That's important. Engaging with a smear campaign validates it. The better play is to keep your documentation visible and let the facts speak without you having to shout them. Her second move was more aggressive. She contacted the city's building department and alleged that I had made additional unpermitted modifications to my property, specifically claiming that a small retaining wall I'd built along my side yard last summer had been done without a permit. This was false. I had pulled the permit. It was on file. The building inspector who came out a bored young man who clearly had better things to do, looked at my permit, looked at the wall, and left without issuing any citation. Darlene apparently called the department twice more asking for updates, which the department noted in their records as repeated unfounded inquiry from same complainant. That paper trail would matter later. Her third move surprised me most because it suggested she'd gotten some advice, bad advice, but advice. She convened an emergency board meeting and passed a resolution with her casting vote as the tiebreaker to formally amend the HOA's bylaws to remove the special meeting petition right entirely. Just delete it from the governing documents. You can't do that. You especially can't do it retroactively to nullify a pending petition. This is not a complicated legal point. It's the equivalent of changing the rules of the game after you've already lost a hand and claiming the previous deal doesn't count. The amendment she passed was itself procedurally invalid because the governing documents required a 2/3 membership vote for bylaw amendments, and a 4-person board resolution doesn't constitute a membership vote. Douglas Parish sent a letter the next day pointing this out, citing the specific bylaw provision and noting that any attempt to act on the amendment would expose individual board members to personal liability. Philip Serrano, the treasurer who had voted against the censure, quietly called me that evening. He was resigning from the board. He told me he'd had enough. He was going to submit his written resignation in the morning. He also told me something I hadn't known, that Darlene had proposed at the same emergency meeting using HOA funds to retain an attorney to pursue all available legal options against Gare Holloway. The attorney she named was her brother-in-law. Another conflict of interest right there on the minutes. Philip said he'd vote no. She pushed it through anyway, 4-1. I thanked him. I asked if he'd be willing to provide a written statement about what he'd witnessed. He said yes. He said he should have spoken up sooner. You're speaking up now, I said. That's what counts. I was also watching something else develop quietly, something Darlene had no idea was happening. The city's public works office, having reviewed my complaint and the lapsed maintenance documentation, had referred the matter to the city attorney's office for assessment of municipal remedies. The city attorney was looking at whether to pursue cost recovery from the HOA for the road damage. That process was moving slowly as city legal processes do, but it was moving and it would surface at the public meeting. 29 days became 20. 20 became 10. The trap was set. I just had to wait for Darlene to step into it on her own. In the final week before the public meeting, Darlene made her last big play. And it was the kind of move that tells you everything about a person's character in a single decision. She reached out to 2 households who had signed the special meeting petition and offered them something. Not explicitly, not in writing. She was too smart for that, or thought she was. But 2 residents separately told me, with visible discomfort, that Darlene had approached them individually and suggested that their concerns about the HOA might be resolved more quickly if they withdrew their signatures, and that she'd personally advocate for a reduction in their dues assessment for the upcoming fiscal year. One of the residents told her no and called me immediately. The other withdrew their signature and had the decency to tell me directly, apologetically, that they just wanted the conflict to stop. I understood that conflict is exhausting. Not everybody wants to be in the middle of a fight, even a righteous one. But what Darlene had done, explicitly or implicitly offering a financial benefit in exchange for a resident withdrawing from a legitimate governance petition, was exactly the kind of thing that has a name in corporate and nonprofit law: improper inducement. When it's done with HOA funds or association resources, it can rise to a breach of fiduciary duty. I documented both conversations carefully: time, date, resident names with their permission, and the substance of what was offered. I gave that documentation to Douglas Parish. He added it to what was becoming a very thick file. In the meantime, I had been quietly working on something physical, something tangible that would matter at the meeting, both legally and visually. I'd commissioned an independent traffic safety assessment of the Cloverfield Lane curve from a licensed traffic engineer named Bertrand Molly, who had 27 years of municipal consulting experience and the kind of dense authoritative reports that carry real weight with city officials. Bertrand's assessment confirmed what we already knew. The curve had suboptimal sight distance for vehicle speeds above 25 miles per hour. The removal of the speed bumps had restored a documented hazard condition, and reinstatement was recommended. He included 3 incident report citations from the city's own database, near misses, and 1 minor collision at that exact curve in the years before the bumps were installed. Bertrand would appear at the public meeting as an expert presenter. I'd arranged that a week in advance. I'd also, and this is the part that required the most patience, let Darlene believe she still had time to control the narrative. She had no idea that the city attorney's office had completed its assessment. She had no idea that the reporter from the TV station was already doing background research. She had no idea that Philip Serrano had provided a written statement. She had no idea about Bertrand's report. She had no idea that I'd been quietly organizing 31 households into a coordinated block, ready to vote the moment a special meeting was called. She believed she'd weather the storm. Her last email blast 3 days before the public meeting was actually upbeat. She announced that the HOA's attorney had reviewed all pending matters and found no grounds for resident concerns, and that the special meeting petition was under review for procedural compliance. She signed it with a cheerful onward and upward, Cloverfield Lane. I read that email on my kitchen table, and I felt something I'm almost embarrassed to admit. I felt sorry for her, not enough to stop, but enough to understand that this woman had constructed such a complete internal narrative of her own righteousness that she genuinely could not see what was about to happen. Some people don't understand how power actually works until the moment it's taken away from them. Darlene was about to have a very educational experience. The morning of the public meeting, I put on a clean shirt, drove downtown, and set up early. Priscilla Adler, the TV reporter, was already there with a camera operator, talking to Constantine from Public Works near the entrance. Bertrand Molly had his materials organized on the table. Terrence, Beverly, and Felicity sat in the front row. 37 of our 71 households were represented in that room. Darlene walked in at 6:58, 2 minutes before the meeting started, and stopped when she saw the camera, just for a moment. Something crossed her face. Then she sat down in the second row, straightened her lanyard, and looked forward. Let's go. The Columbus City Quarterly Public Works meeting is held in a municipal conference room that seats about 80 people, with laminate tables, a city seal on the wall, and fluorescent overhead lights that make everyone look faintly like they haven't slept. The presiding official that evening was Deputy Director of Public Works, a tall, methodical man named Ronald Ketch, who opened the meeting, called attendance, and moved through the first 2 agenda items: a street repaving update and a sewer line inspection report, with the paced efficiency of a man who had done this approximately 900 times. Then he called the Cloverfield Lane matter. I was the first to speak. I introduced myself, submitted my full documentation package to the official record, the lapsed maintenance agreement, the city permit history, the stop work order, the HOA financial disclosures, the conflict of interest evidence, and Philip Serrano's written statement, and gave a clear 7-minute summary of the sequence of events. No drama, no emotion, just chronological facts delivered in the voice of a man who has spent 22 years in rooms where precision matters more than volume. Ronald Ketch and the 2 deputy officials flanking him were making notes throughout. Then Bertrand Molly presented. His traffic safety assessment took 12 minutes, included 3 data charts, and concluded with a formal recommendation that the city reinstate the speed control measures at the Cloverfield Lane curve under direct municipal authority, not HOA authority, municipal authority. He cited the near-miss incidents. He cited Cooper Briggs's accident. He named no names, but he looked at the room when he said that the removal of safety infrastructure without proper authorization had created a measurable public hazard. You could hear the fluorescent lights hum. Then Constance Yee spoke, representing her department. She confirmed the lapsed maintenance agreement. She confirmed that the HOA had received 2 non-renewal notices in 2018 and 2019 and had not responded. She confirmed that the removal work had been conducted without a city permit on a street that as of 2019 had reverted fully to municipal jurisdiction. She concluded by noting that the city attorney's office had assessed the situation and determined that the municipality had grounds to seek cost recovery from the HOA for road damage estimated at approximately $11,000, and that the city intended to pursue that recovery. $11,000 for a job that had taken 2 guys one morning to complete and had destroyed 2 rubber speed bumps that cost me $4,200 to install. That is the sound of consequences arriving. Darlene requested the floor. Ronald Ketch gave it to her. She stood up. She was composed. I'll say that. Whatever else she was, she didn't flinch. She argued that the HOA had acted in good faith under its interpretation of the governing documents, that the maintenance agreement's expiration had not been communicated to the current board, and that the financial irregularities I'd raised were mischaracterizations of routine association expenditures. Ronald Ketch nodded politely. Then he asked her one question. Miss Whitfield, are you aware of an entity called Whitfield Property Consulting, LLC? And if so, can you describe your relationship to it? The room went absolutely silent. Priscilla Adler's camera was running. Darlene said, That's a private matter unrelated to this proceeding. It's in the documents submitted to this proceeding, Ketch said without inflection. He tapped the stack of papers in front of him. It'll be part of the public record either way. That was the moment. Not a speech, not a confrontation, just a public official, a stack of documents, and a woman who had spent 11 months building a petty empire in a neighborhood on a street she didn't control, looking at the evidence of her own decisions laid flat on a laminate table under fluorescent lights. Beverly Kessler, sitting to my left, leaned over and said quietly, Play stupid games, win stupid prizes. Terrence finished from my right. The city formally referred the financial conflict of interest matter to the county prosecutor's office for review. The following week, Douglas Parish filed the civil demand letter to the HOA simultaneously, citing the self-dealing transaction, the improper petition interference, the defamation exposure, and the cost recovery liability, and demanded that Darlene Whitfield resign the HOA presidency within 10 days as part of a comprehensive resolution agreement. She resigned in 7. The city reinstatement of the speed bumps, 2 new rubberized units installed by a city contractor at city expense with a formal traffic safety designation, happened 6 weeks later, a Tuesday morning, just like the first time, except this time I stood on my front lawn in the sunshine and watched them go in. Cooper Briggs rode his bike past while they were working and didn't even stop to look because to him it was just a road, which is exactly how it should be. Here's where I want to tell you what actually mattered about all of this. Not the legal win, not Darlene's resignation, not even the speed bumps going back in. What mattered was what happened to the neighborhood afterward. The special membership meeting we'd petitioned for took place 6 weeks after the public works session. By that point, the board had lost 2 members, Darlene to her resignation, Philip Serrano by prior resignation, and the remaining members had agreed to hold open elections rather than fight a process that was no longer worth fighting. The election brought in 3 new board members. Terrence Dobbs, who ran because Felicity told him to and was too stubborn to say no, Felicity Granger herself, and a younger resident named Aubrey Castellano, who'd moved to the neighborhood 2 years ago and had watched the whole situation unfold with the wide eyes of someone still learning that neighborhoods are political ecosystems. The new board's first official action was to renew the road maintenance agreement with the city, establishing a clear, documented jurisdictional framework so that nobody would ever have to argue about whose road it was again. Their second action was to commission a full independent audit of the HOA's finances, which confirmed the reserve fund deficiency and the irregular Whitfield property consulting disbursement. The HOA demanded reimbursement from Darlene directly. She ultimately returned $5,000 of the $8,000 in a settlement that allowed the county prosecutor to close the matter without criminal charges. As for the civil defamation matter, Douglas Parish sent the demand letter, and Darlene's brother-in-law attorney wrote back a 2-page response that was mostly bluster. In the end, it settled for a formal written retraction of the unauthorized and potentially fraudulent language in her original letter, distributed to all 67 households that had received the original. It was a 1-paragraph note that didn't use the word apology anywhere, but it was on the record and it was on paper. Good enough. The HOA dues went back down to $85. Herschel Okafor sent a card from Arizona. I don't know how he found out, but he found out. It just said, "Knew you'd figure it out. The street was always yours." But here's the thing I actually want to end on, because I think it's the part of this story that means the most to me. Felicity Granger, at the new board's first real meeting, proposed using a portion of the recovered reserve funds, once the account was properly replenished, to establish what she called the Cloverfield Lane Community Safety Fund. Not a lot of money. $500 a year drawn from dues, earmarked for traffic safety improvements and neighborhood infrastructure grants. The first year, they partnered with the city to fund new reflective signage at 3 other dangerous curves in the broader neighborhood. Curves that were accidents waiting to happen in the same way ours had been. The second year, they expanded the fund and added a small annual scholarship for a graduating senior from the local high school who demonstrated commitment to community service. $300. Not a life-changing amount, but an amount that says this community sees you and what you do for others matters here. Cooper Briggs is 13 now. He still rides his bike on Cloverfield Lane. He goes right over those new speed bumps without thinking about them. That's the whole point.